Thank you. I guess I'll start us off. Is that right? Okay. Unless you want to, Scott.
Yeah, I don't know how to pick this kind of thing off, so yeah.
I think you probably know more than you're letting on. But anyway, thank you to JCCH for putting on this kind of event. Thank you, Scott, for being willing to share your mana'o with all of us. And thank you, audience members, because you're the people who care. And that means so much, especially in this era. We're kind of emerging from the pandemic. I've been talking to a few of you people about mental health issues that I see amongst young people and older. But really coming together in whatever way we can, coming together in the flesh. It's like, are we getting used to it? I hope so. I hope so. Even for me, I'm still not sure what you do with a hug. But although I accept lays profusely, thank you so much. But I think the purpose of our goal today is to find out more about our author here, Scott. Find out who he is, what makes him tick, what makes him write these novels that so many of us are enjoying, and what makes those novels great to see a kind of noir fiction within the context of a local, within the context of what's supposed to be sunny paradise, right? What do you do with dark stories in the context of sunny paradise? So first of all, thank you, welcome, Scott. And can I field the first question?
Sure.
You can also refuse to answer any of these questions, because as an anthropologist, I'm nosy beyond what is polite. No, I don't want to know that part. But Scott, I'm so interested in how you got to write. I'm always interested in local boy who's not doing the typical local stuff. Why aren't you selling insurance? So Scott, tell us just a little bit, just briefly, your journey from and we didn't ask where he went to high school, and it wasn't revealed in the intro. So where did you go to high school?
I graduated from Kaiser High School.
Oh, okay, okay. Oh my God, at first I thought it was Iolani, but.
Well, yeah, I went to Iolani for 10 years, okay. And then they asked me not to come back.
Oh, okay, so now you see we're getting some of the flavor of Bad Boy Scott, right? Okay, got it. Okay, so, but how does anyone go from Kaiser High School, you need me a little bit?
Yeah.
Okay.
I forgot to mention we are recording this
on
video today.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So how you go from Kaiser High School to, am I right in understanding you went to NYU for undergraduate? I mean, that in itself is a brave move for many people at Kaiser. Why don't you talk first about that move, but then where you go from even NYU to doing what you do, which is so out of the box, right? Which is so unusual, if you would.
Well, Kaiser NYU, I actually had a stop in Washington State for 1 year, which is a little more typical. I decided that I wanted to go east after spending 1 year in Pullman, Washington, which is pretty much in the middle of, this is not what you think of when you think of Washington State, pine trees and snow. Well, there's lots of snow out in Pullman, but it's pretty much a wheat field that's 8 miles away from Idaho. And I needed something a little more urban. I went east to New York City, to NYU, and at the time, it's because it was possible. Today, NYU is kind of like, it has a very low acceptance rate. Today, I couldn't get in if I applied.
False modesty.
Yeah.
Right.
But,
False.
my daughter, who's not here yet, I think, got into NYU, and she said, Dad, they offered me $25,000. And I told her, well, I got $25,000 from NYU, but that was a full ride back then. Today, that's barely a third, I think, of what it would cost. But I went there because it was possible financially. Once upon a time, it's not really for a lot of families today. Detective fiction is what I discovered when I was in New York, and that was a fiction of Raymond Chandler, mostly, and Dashiell Hammett. And I read all kinds of things, but Chandler spoke to me. that remained my favorite type of fiction, and because of that, I found occupation investigation, which turned out to be nothing like the books. It's funny you should say, why am I not selling insurance? I think I started out in the insurance industry. My very first job out of college was working for a private investigator, but that was insurance investigations, right? Which was a natural segue into insurance claims, which is really in-house insurance investigations for about 7 years. Then I decided to go into law enforcement. I was a state investigator for 3 years, and for the last 22 years, I've been with the federal government. I work now for U.S. Customs and Border Protection. I supervise an intelligence unit there. I work part-time out of the FBI on one of their task forces, counterintelligence task force. Although I think I'm not supposed to say that because I haven't run that through their media office or something. So if anyone watches this, they can disregard that last statement. And that's what led me to where I am today. Maybe it's not a typical path, but that's how it happened.
Yeah, thank you so much. And just a little bit something about detective fiction in general. What is it that kind of gets to you? What's the attraction for you in particular? I mean, lots of people, I'm assuming many people here also like detective fiction, and everybody has their own reasons, right? But what about for you? What is it about detective fiction?
For me, well, and especially the fiction of Raymond Chandler and Dashiell Hammett and maybe Ross MacDonald a little after them, although he was like kind of contemporary, was the cadence and the rhythm. You know, there's all kinds of detective fiction. Agatha Christie comes to mind, which is more what they call a traditional mystery. Raymond Chandler and Dashiell Hammett were of the hard-boiled school, the noir school of detective fiction, and that's the fiction that spoke to me. Subject matter is darker, it's a lot more mundane, and the narrator, often as a first-person narrator, is an introspective narrator, and this is somebody who becomes philosophical at times during their narration. It's full of monologues, and it's full of dialogues that are full of rhythm, and that's what I appreciated most about noir detective fiction, was the way it read and the way it sounded. They make great movies, obviously, you know, Maltese Falcon and The Big Sleep and those movies. It was a genre that has its own look to it, especially the clothing and the architecture, the period noir, which is why I set mine during that period as well. One of the many reasons I set mine during that period, but that's what fascinated me. Traditional mystery was not really my cup of tea. Those are what they call locked door mysteries, or it's like a puzzle within a puzzle within a puzzle, and those are fascinating to a certain extent, but they certainly don't have the raw human element that noir has, and that's what drew me to that type of fiction.
Yeah, thank you. I hear, though, in what you're talking about, certain kinds of, let me run some by you, some themes that I'm hearing from you. One is darkness, okay. Another is a kind of sensuality. We're hearing about rhythms, cadences, looks, fashion styles, etc. What do you say? I mean, peeling back the onion of Scott.
Well, those things I think are correct, and those are part of the reason I was attracted to that genre. Rhythm, sensuality, darkness. These are things that don't appear in traditional mysteries that much. For the most part, traditional mysteries have given birth, this is with apologies to my friends that write this type of mystery, but they've given birth to what we call the cozy mystery. Those are those paperbacks you see in Barnes & Noble with a cat on the cover, and they have puns for titles, and they're kind of sanitized. The violence takes place off stage. There's always some protagonist who is an amateur protagonist. Usually she, and I'm going to say she because it's almost often a female protagonist, is much more clever than the police are. She's one step ahead of them. And it's all about these cute misadventures and solving a problem. I think that the type of detective fiction I'm more interested in is less about solving a problem and solving a mystery than it is about the journey to the conclusion. The conclusion is not always happy. My sister, who's here, once asked me in a prior reading, "What is noir?" And I told her, "Well, noir, it's a French word for black, right? It's their term, but it's that type of fiction. And if you want to sum it up in a nutshell, mostly does not have a happy ending, and a lot of the writing that comes out of this tradition of detective fiction doesn't often have a clean resolution or a happy ending. But I think that's more like real life, and that's what drew me to it. I think it's a truer portrait.
And just backing you up to Scott Kikkawa, who's thinking about, I mean, enjoying these mysteries, granted, and enjoying mysteries is something that many of us do, but writing one is yet another step, right? Another kind of leap into that, I don't know, do you call it a deep abyss or something like that? But what gave you, I guess, the confidence, the chutzpah, to jump into it and to write yourself?
This was actually a drunken dare that happened one night in Kainai.
I knew there was a story.
My good friend, Dr. Jason Chun at UH West Oahu, who's not here right now because he's jet lagged. He just came back from Osaka a day ago, or 2 days ago, or he would have been here. But he was the one. We were in a bar on Waialae Avenue one night, and I had been complaining to him about the lack of really good mystery fiction set in Hawaii. There are a ton of mysteries that have been written and set right here in Hawaii, but they are mostly written by people that are outside Hawaii. And if you're familiar with any of them, well, many of them are cozy mysteries. Some of them are not. But what they're mostly concerned with is Hawaii as a setting. And that was my primary complaint with most of those mysteries, that Hawaii's a setting. The protagonist is usually somebody from outside of Hawaii that comes to Hawaii, and it's all just a pretty backdrop, kind of for the mischief of tourists and others. And when you look at the plots, they're kind of cookie-cutter plots, it could have been set in Singapore or Paris or New Orleans or wherever with a backdrop, and there's a generic plot that goes with it. And I complained that we should probably do better than that. We should probably the people and the land here are more than just props. Nobody, to my knowledge, had written anything like what I was thinking of. Vicki Newell had written traditional mysteries, which are very good, but hers are more in the vein of that Agatha Christie type of locked door mystery, and they're set mostly on Oahu in the 1930s. So this is a pre-war era and still territorial. But nobody had done it through a noir lens. Chris McKinney, of course, has written a lot of noir books set here in Hawaii, but his are contemporary. I was interested in a period noir book. So Jason said, well, why don't you write one? Instead of complain about how there's nothing like that exists, why don't you write one? So I took him up on this. This was in 2011. I came up with a first draft by 2013 and had shopped it out to about 100 New York literary agents. I got a request for a full or partial manuscript about 20% of the time, which I understand is pretty good, but they all ended in rejection, every single one of them. And the reason for that was because they felt they couldn't find a vision for selling it, and the most honest rejection, and this is a very famous agent, who told me she loved the writing, but she felt that America was not ready for a Hawaii as ugly as the one I portray. And what she meant by that really was that places like New York City or Los Angeles are already dirty in the American imagination, that if people want to disparage places like that and look at their ugly history, nobody is going to pay attention to that, or nobody's going to flinch when you do it. But Hawaii is America's pristine tropic playground. Everybody has an image on the mainland of what they want Hawaii to be, and is not the Hawaii of my stories. Is not what they want to see. We didn't have Jim Crow here like they did in the South, but we had something that was close in a lot of ways. We had a colonial history, which was all about divide and conquer strategies of plantation owners to keep ethnic groups separate in separate camps with separate wages to create resentment and to prevent them from organizing. We have a history that's full of things that is not really explored in popular culture. So it ended in rejection, and that's why I found a home at Bamboo Ridge. Maybe that was the only home I could have found for this work. And it's a perfect place for it. And I'm really lucky that they took it on. You know, I'm not a poet or a literary fiction writer, but they felt there was some literary merit to it, and here we are, 3 books in.
Yeah, thank you so much. And you know, it is an opportune moment to give a shout out to Bamboo Ridge for bringing local voices to light in various genres, maybe starting out with the kind of fiction that Wing Tech does, et cetera, but branching out now to Scott's version of a local voice. So thank you, Bamboo Ridge, for all that you've done and continue to do. Thank you. And Scott, I'm going to ask you a question that everybody wants to know of authors. Where are you in these books? Are you one of the characters?
My answer to that is always, I am none of the characters and I am all of them. Because I make all of them up. I put words in all their mouths, so all of them are me. They ask if any of the characters are based on people I know, and the short answer to that is no, I make them all up, so they're all me to a large extent. Even the female characters, even the older characters and the younger characters. I give them all voice, so to a large extent they're all me. But I get asked particularly about the protagonist. Is that me? Is that a version of me? And my answer to that is no more than any of the rest of the characters are. Okay. The fact that I do law enforcement for a paycheck and he does law enforcement for a paycheck is that's where the similarities kind of really end. It was funny because the last Left Coast Crime convention that I attended back in 2020, right at the beginning of the pandemic, they shut it down after day 1 of the convention because we had in excess of 250 people. Back then 250 was considered a safe number for a gathering, and that changed rapidly overnight. But they had put me on a panel on police procedurals, which I thought was really an error because what I've written, I think, was kind of an anti-procedural. This was in an era where we were before lawsuits and we were before DNA and things like that that make law enforcement today really tedious and by the book, more so than it was in an era before these things were in place. So I don't draw on any of my experiences in my professional life to create a character that does something that I'm not even going to call it similar in fiction. So there's not much of me personally in these characters except for the fact that I create them.
Okay, all right, thank you. And I noticed that your fictions, your stories are set in post-war Hawaii, right? What is it about post-war that kind of triggers your imagination, that becomes your kind of, just what is it about post-war Hawaii that becomes your muse, if you will?
Well, muse is a good term to use, Christine, because that's what it really is. It's because I have an aesthetic obsession with the period. I think that in the 1950s, there is no other time in Hawaii's or America's history where both men and women looked better. They dressed better. It was all about hats and gloves. Everyone wore a suit, even here. The makeup, the cars. You could tell cars by their make and model just by the silhouette. You can't do that today. If you look at a car today, all of them look alike until you walk up and take a look at the logo on the back. Music, even the music was better dressed, right? Sinatra, Nat King Cole, Miles Davis. that type of jazz, the West Coast cool school of jazz. It's an it was an aesthetic obsession, I would say, with pre-rock and roll 1950s America. I think with the advent of rock and roll, there's nothing wrong with rock and roll. I like that too. But I think it changed the aesthetic forever. I think that when Kennedy became president, that's when people stopped wearing hats regularly outdoors. But I like the aesthetic of the period. And I think significantly, this 10-year window, I'm going to call it like, or a 15 or 10-year window from the end of World War II until statehood, it was a very short window in time, but it was a critical window for a lot of the transformation from a colonial Hawaii into the Hawaii we know today. I think by 1959, by statehood, we were already on the path to becoming what we know today as Hawaii. So that's why I made a conscious choice, if I keep writing these books, not to set them beyond statehood. And after World War II, because the post-war period is when all these changes started occurring. World War II was an incredible time of transformation. I think that at one point in our state's history, a lot of the islands, all the islands were kind of on equal footing economically for one period, or the argument can be made that they were on equal footing politically and economically. It was the war that changed everything. It was World War II, the influx of the military and of those workers that were needed to support the war effort that kind of transformed Honolulu and Oahu into the major center of everything in the state that it is today. And that's what kind of started us on the path to change politically as well. The so-called Democratic Revolution of 1954. And I started writing these books, or set these books, in the period that was immediately before the 54 elections. The books after these three books run into the 54 elections and just after them. But they're not going to go beyond statehood. But importantly, territorial history, I think, has been long a neglected area of Hawaii history. Thankfully, we have a lot of focus these days on early Hawaii history, on the monarchy. We have a lot of focus on the unlawful overthrow of the monarchy and annexation. But a lot of what the territorial years are kind of glossed over in the popular imagination of the history of these places. We have the monarchy, we have the overthrow, we have annexation, and then there's some mention of World War II, and then we have statehood, and we're in our modern tourist-based economy today. Those years in between are largely ignored, and we have some last vestiges of it, or some cultural vestiges of it, which exist today in kind of a sanitized format. When I mean sanitized format, I mean, as a child, I remember participating in May Day programs and pageants where we were all asked to dress in our ethnic costumes. I don't know if anybody remembers that. Japanese, so my mom put me in a hoppy coat and put something around my head. And then the Chinese kids came in their outfits, et cetera, et cetera. You can't do that today, by the way, because most kids wouldn't know what costume to wear. They're part of a lot of things, and that's a great thing. But back then, what that was really was that was a holdover, I think, of the old plantation era, and kind of celebrating the diversity of the plantation by whitewashing or covering up what the ugliness of that diversity was, which is divide and conquer, which is everybody lived in their own camps, everybody got a different wage, and this was done on purpose so that they wouldn't organize. I think that the groups came together despite that, and that's one of the miracles of the territorial period, were those labor movements that culminated in the strike of 1949 and brought us forward and really precipitated statehood and what we know today. But for those of us, I think, that are neither Native Hawaiian nor Haole, the territorial years were our crucible of struggle. So if you're Japanese, if you're Chinese, if you're Korean or Portuguese or Puerto Rican, or Filipino, if you're from any of those groups that has a history going back decades into the territorial years, this is your history, this is our history, and it's largely not touched on. So I thought it was really important to put something out there that's at least in popular culture.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you, thank you. And just a little personal, my own personal remembering of May Day is that we weren't given a choice of what costume to wear. So it was like first graders were first graders were Chinese, second graders were Filipino, third graders were Puerto Rican, fourth graders were Japanese, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't know about your school, but that's what we did. Sorry, we didn't have a choice. and we didn't self-identify, we just did this in turn. And just a comment, so it's really interesting to think of your choice of this period, say 1945 to just before 1960 or something like that, because it sounds like both a period of a certain kind of naivete, a certain kind of innocence, but also at a time of kind of sublimated inequities and tensions and really conflicts. And maybe those both layers come out in terms of style. And I don't know if you can comment it or not, but.
That's great, because that's what noir is to me, right? Raymond Chandler's noir was all about a thin veneer of respectability over some really bad behavior, and his vehicle for that was Los Angeles, or one might specifically say Hollywood, because Hollywood is a thin veneer of respectability personified. It's all about the dream machine and the glitz and glamour, which is overlaid in the entertainment industry over LA in general, which is not always a very clean place. Even within that industry, as Chandler pointed out, there was, on a regular basis, there was sexual harassment, there was narcotics dealing and use, there was money laundering, there was a bunch of terrible behavior, and a lot of the 40s and 50s ethic in Hollywood was to push all of that under the rug, and they had people who were hired just for that purpose, to cover up homosexuality and extramarital affairs with prearranged dates and photo shoots. And Chandler wrote about all this, saying, this is my city, and this is what it really is under the veneer of respectability. I thought, what could be more noir than Honolulu in the territorial years? Because it was a veneer of respectability over a lot of bad behavior. I think that my own community, the Japanese American community here, is a thin veneer of respectability over a lot of bad behavior. This, by the way, is book 5, which is which was just completed, and it's based on. It was inspired by Christine's book, Crowning the Nice Girl. I love that book. I read it and I said, you know what, this is really noir. This has to be its book, The Cherry Blossom Festival, in its formative years. Like, what is that? You know, we're such a passive-aggressive community, right? We're a community that always says that bad things are done by other people when nothing can be further from the truth. And nobody's really writing about that. You know, I wanted to write about it, and I wanted to put that out there because we're a community that is not just diverse in a good way, we're diverse in a bad way too. And I think that it serves everybody to examine it in something like literature. And it's, to my knowledge, it always flabbergasts me that it hasn't been done yet in the way that I'm doing it. I always thought, you know, somebody must have done this already. And when I take a look at it, it hasn't been done yet, so I'm continuing to do it.
Yeah, the grandmas keep putting a futong over those stories or something like that. Just now that you mentioned your latest book, can you tell us something about how you go about choosing topics, the research process, and then the writing process for you?
Sure. You know, I am really privileged and lucky to be a member of a writers group, the Bamboo Ridge Study Group. Everyone in this group is famous except me. Wing Tech Lum, who's sitting, I don't know if he's in here or he's outside. You know, Juliet Kono, is in this group. Eric Chalk and Daryl Lum are in this group. Lee Cataluna, although she hasn't shown up lately. You know, we have a lot of famous people in this group. And Christy Passion, who proposed my membership, told me that the process for induction is really, you have to have unanimous acceptance by everyone. If there's just like one dissenting vote, you don't get in. And I'm lucky that they let me in. They're mostly poets and literary fiction writers, and the best as far as I'm concerned, not just here but anywhere. And I'm really lucky that they let a guy in that writes detective stories into this group. But they asked me how it is I'm so prolific, because for a lot of them, the creative process is a longer and maybe more difficult thing. And I tell them it's because I'm a genre writer. I'm not an artist like the rest of them, I don't think, you know. I figure out when and where I want this thing. I drop a dead body in it and figure out how it got there. And that's pretty much my process for writing, right? The rest is kind of embellishment, I think, and the research is part of that embellishment, but I think it's a critical part. So the part of the first step is inspiration by one thought or event. So what inspired Kona Winds, the first book, were the labor strikes, the dock and sugar strikes in 1949, and what my imagined fallout from those strikes would be 3 or 4 years later. That's what inspired that book. Book 2, Red Dirt, was inspired by the House Un-American Activities Committee, communist investigations here, and the Smith Act trials, the Smith Act trial of the so-called Hawaii 7. This is something that's well documented in academic research, but in popular culture, it's rarely spoken of. And the third book, Char Siu, is based on the real-life HPD kickback scandals in Chinatown. And it's a little anachronistic. The real-life scandal at HPD happened in the late 1940s under Chief Gabrielson. And what I've done was I brought it about 4 years or 5 years into the future, because it's plausible that it was still going on and it was still happening then. And that's kind of my process. I strive for historic accuracy, what James Elroy calls the wiggle room in history. So I have to keep reminding people that this is fiction. I make this stuff up. A lot of people have criticized my work for being, well, that never happened. And so, of course it didn't happen. I made this up. It's fiction. But what I strive for is for the reader to think that it could have happened, that it happens in that space between actual events and people, that this is something that might have happened. These aren't real-life murders. These people never really lived or died. And the detectives certainly really didn't live and solve these cases. But I strive to create something that people believe could have happened, and that's where a lot of careful research comes in. I think maybe one ulterior motive for picking the period is that very few people remain alive today who remember this era very well. I think that most of the people living today that lived through this era were very young people when this period was actually taking place during this era. And as young people, they have very vivid memories, though, and I use a lot of that anecdotal research as well. My own mother, I've had talks with her nowadays. It's a little disjointed. She repeats herself a lot, but she's been a great source for a lot of the atmospheric text because it's all anecdotal, and other people, her contemporaries I've talked to. But that's a process, and for me it's a fascinating process because I was a history major after all in college, and I enjoy research. A lot of writers you talk to will say this is their most hated part of the task. I love it. I get to sit in the resource center downstairs where the air conditioning works all the time, maybe a little too well, and really get lost in primary sources.
Yeah. So again, another shout out to JCCH and its
Absolutely.
Resource Center for providing this kind of data, in effect, for people like Scott and others. So academics, non-academics, fiction, nonfiction. I think the Resource Center is such a treasure trove of just stuff piled high. It's where you can find all the cherry blossom book, festival booklets from.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
I pulled the first three, 1953, 54, and 55.
Right.
I think. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Taking a look at them. The most fascinating thing about those are the ads.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, before I turn the questions to you, people who are here in the audience, I just wanted, JCCH did collect some questions, so I just wanted to field a couple of these. One was from Kevin Kawamoto, and he asks, were you interested in becoming an author from an early age?
No. No, I didn't know till 2011 I could even do this thing, I drew a lot. If anything, I thought I was going to be a cartoonist. I was a cartoonist for my college newspaper at NYU. And I thought maybe that was my avenue for artistic expression. I had no inkling that I could be a writer until Jason challenged me to do it, about 15 years ago or so. So this is all by chance. And I don't think this could not have happened at any other stage in my life. Could not have happened earlier time in my life, but no, it wasn't something that I had a wish for as a child. I'm a child of television, like a lot of us that grew up in the 70s. I read as well, but aspiring to be a writer wasn't something that I thought was within reach. That's because writing has changed so radically over the last 5 to 10 years that is now in reach for everybody. Anybody can write anything and put it out there. Self-publishing is an option which is available for almost all today. Back then, it was an era of gatekeepers, and you thought that only the most talented, gifted individuals that could put something on a page could ever aspire to write something. And so it was a different thing. It was a different aspiration. I didn't think that I had that talent, and quite frankly, high school writing assignments were not what fascinated me or many other people. But yeah, it was something that came up fairly recently.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And then another thing that in which you were talking, shout outs to friends who might challenge us to do something that you didn't think you could do, but your friends had more confidence in you, maybe a different vision of you than you yourself might have, but also a shout out to reading. Because, in some ways, writing is very imitative. So the more we read, the more we might cultivate a sense of our own writing. It leads to the next question from Ms. Char Hashimoto, who asks, how did you find your, quote, voice for writing your novels?
Well, that was largely inspired by Raymond Chandler and his first-person detective narrative. When I read from my work, I always do it in a voice that I call the detective monotone, because that's the way I envision it actually sounds in my head. And the detective monotone in my mind is inspired by the report form or the police report. And what that is a paring down. And by the way, I read a lot of real-life police reports, and it doesn't resemble anything anybody would want to read for fun. It's very dry, but it has a cadence to it where it's shortened into a lot of like staccato beats. So it's something that I saw Chandler do at a certain point, and James Ellroy, who's a more contemporary writer, who also writes a retro noir fiction, also uses this style where it's very staccato, where he has a lot of 1- and 2-word sentences, and it follows a certain rhythm. That's kind of where the voice comes from, and I will always, well, I shouldn't say always, but for the foreseeable future, I think I'll always write in the first person. I know that there are a lot of writers, especially fiction writers, who talk about the third-person narrative and a second-person narrative, like these really experimental and unique points of view styles. For me, there will always ever only going to be the first-person narrative, and the reason for that is because I'm basically lazy. It's because I don't have to develop characters all the way. all the characters in my books are all viewed through the lens of one individual, so they don't have to be particularly deep. They just have to be perceived by through the lens of one individual. So the first-person narrative appeals to me in kind of in a convenient sense, but also appeals to me in a literary sense because you really get inside the head of the narrator when you're delivering it from his or her point of view. Everything is filtered through that person's thoughts, and that's what gets onto the page. So that's where that voice comes from.
Yeah, thank you so much. I will ask one more question from that we received, but in the meantime, this gives you a chance to formulate your own questions, right? So get ready. So here's your last question from that got emailed in, and this from Ms. Annie Nakao, and she asks, you have a sympathetic view of Native history and the current social and cultural issues affecting Native Hawaiians. I assume you've heard of the Christopher Dede case. We have. And given your line of work in federal law enforcement, is the case something you might explore in a future book, or at least worth discussing for you?
Sure. When I read this question, it kind of took me back about 4 years ago to one of the last Hawaii Book and Music Festivals they had on the Honolulu Hale grounds. This is Roger Jelinek's big, what was his yearly thing. And that's where I got to have lunch with my friend Dr. John Rosa, who I don't think is here today. But John and I had this discussion about the Dede case. And this was when the Dede case was newer and was fresher in the imagination of folks. And what John said was that he felt there were a lot of parallels between the Dede case and the Massey case, or the Massey Kahahawaii case. And we had a discussion about that. I felt that there was a fundamental difference between the Dede case and the Kahahawaii case in that in the Kahahawaii case, and what it is in a nutshell, the Massey case was the allegation of rape or sex assault by 5 local males on a haole woman. And this went to trial, and the 5 men were acquitted. But what happened was the victim's husband took a couple of men. They kidnapped one of the defendants, Joe Kahahawaii, threw him in the trunk of a car, drove him all the way out near Hawaii Kai, and shot him. So this was the second trial. And what happened in that case, in the Kahahawaii case, is the defendants in that case were actually convicted. Where the injustice took place, or the miscarriage of justice, was in the sentencing. So the sentence was, they say the territorial governor, with pressure from the federal government and the military, commuted their sentence to time served in his office of 1 hour. Released, and then they were put on transportation back to the mainland, never to return. Okay? In the Dede case, this was a Secret Service agent who was here for the APEC conference, who was doing a security detail along with a lot of other federal law enforcement officers. And there was a run-in in a fast food place with a couple of local males, I think, and he ended up shooting them. The difference, I was telling John, in my mind, was that Dede was acquitted. In other words, there was no guilty verdict in that case. And in my background as a federal law enforcement officer, I don't comment on verdicts. If somebody's acquitted, they're innocent in the eyes of the law, whether or not you agree with the facts. I was not in that courtroom. I was not privy to that evidence, so I can't comment one way or not if that was a miscarriage of justice. An FBI attorney I've frequently worked with, though, has told me, we never lose a case because our subject is innocent. We always lose because of procedural errors. And that's in my experience, that's pretty much a truism, okay? And maybe this applies in the Dede case as well. But I thought that was the fundamental difference. But I think in its cultural context, I agree with John that there are a lot of similarities or parallels you can draw between the Didi case and the Kahahawai case, where there's this miscarriage of justice in favor of a mainland haole who had the backing of the government. And is this a theme that can be explored in future stories? Absolutely. There are cases that are similar and less well known that took place during the territorial period. There's one that comes to mind where the attorney Harriet Bauslog, kind of on a dare, took defense and actually got her subject acquitted. It was what they call the reverse Massey. It was and the name escapes me right now, but it was a local Native Hawaiian perpetrator and a haole female victim. It was a burglary, I think, that went south. It ended up in a homicide, but he ended up acquitted, and they called that kind of a the reverse Massey case. But this took place more contemporarily with where my books are set. I don't use contemporary cases as inspiration for my work. I like to draw period cases or period events as inspiration. And that's because contemporary stuff that happens, I think, is not that interesting from an investigative or a narrative standpoint. And sometimes maybe it's a little too interesting. Like the whole Kealoha thing. God, you couldn't make that up, you know? James Elroy couldn't have written that. Talk about stranger than fiction, you know? But in other cases, a lot of times, whodunit is basically what the literary mystery is all about. And in real life, investigations are not about whodunit because we already know whodunit. It's about proving they did. And nobody wants to read a book about that.
Okay, thank you. With that, I will turn it over to you. Do you have questions of Scott? Yes.
Have you thought about turning any book into a movie?
Thanks, Ken. That's not up to me. That's up to somebody who might want to do it. And I understand that the way movie rights work is that it's a one-shot deal. They give you a lump sum of money for those rights, and they get to do whatever they want with your work. You sign over all rights to that work for that one lump sum of cash. You might be able to have some input if they retain you as a technical advisor or something and get credit. You get mentioned in the credits at the end of the film. But so far nobody's approached me, you know, and I think that's not surprising because if this was too controversial or too ugly for a mainstream Big Five publisher to pick up because they didn't think that an ugly Hawaii would sell, it may be unlikely that a movie about such a subject would have any box office draw too. But I don't know. You know, I think I am peripherally now meeting people in the film industry. Just this week, I had lunch with Crystal Kwok. She's a filmmaker who used to have a talk show in Hong Kong. She used to be a pretty well-known actor in Hong Kong too. I think she had Golden Harvest contract. I think we're contemporaries, but back in the 80s, she did a couple of movies with Jackie Chan or something, and now she is a director and producer of mostly documentaries, I think. She came to Hawaii to work on a doctorate here at UH Mānoa. And Crystal works on projects like that. I've been introduced by Naomi Hirahara, whom I refer to as the godmother of all Asian American mystery writers, who has kindly took an interest in my work. And she's introduced me to a couple of Asian American filmmakers on the West Coast. They told me they've read my books and they have enjoyed them, but mostly they would like to use me as a technical advisor on different projects, you know, working on other Hawaii projects, mostly with organized crime in the 1970s. The 1970s was really the heyday of Hawaii organized crime, right? These are the Napi Palava days and Henry Hui Hui and those characters. And now there seems to be some interest in making series about them on streaming services. So I've been consulted as an expert on those projects. But as far as my own work goes, nobody's knocked on the door yet, officially. But you know what? I'm all ears. They want to give me a check for $10,000 or whatever. It's sold.
Question, Scott, would you play Chic?
I am too old, too slow, and not as quick with my answers in real life. Yeah, so there's no way I could play that character.
Okay, other questions from the audience? Yes.
Well, actually, I have a request. So my preteen granddaughter sees me reading your books, and she wants to know what they're about. I tone them down a little bit,
Mhm.
but give her the gist. And she would like for someone like you to write some books for that age group.
Oh,
But there's nothing up there.
yeah.
You know what? Nobody's ever asked me that before.
I'm asking.
Middle grade fiction, I guess they call it, right?
Absolutely.
Young adult or
That sort of stuff.
middle grade.
Reads it and loves it, and there's nothing wrong.
I'll think about it. You know,
That's a good suggestion.
that is a great suggestion. Yeah, well, I'll have to like dial back my. I'll have to dial back a lot of the cynicism and the other stuff. Yeah. Oh, okay. But yes, certainly the language and the portrayals of other things. But what a great suggestion. I've never been asked that. I've never thought about it. But middle grade and young adult fiction are just about the hottest selling things right now, right? Yeah, there's really very little. I know that there have been stories that were set here that were kind of middle grade. I forget. I think my daughter read some for school at one point, but they had to do with, I think, boys of that age, kind of preteen, set during the war, and it talked about issues like internment, like martial law, but had protagonists, kind of like children as protagonists or preteens as protagonists. What I would probably do is something a little different, but what a wonderful suggestion. I tell her I will consider it.
I agree. That's a wonderful suggestion, and you know, I mean, important to remind ourselves the sophistication of middle school years. I mean, they're very they can be quite knowing. Yeah. Any other questions from the audience? Yes.
How do you come up with the names and personalities for every character in your book?
Oh, that's a great question, and I have to tell you, it's kind of like a multi-layered answer, right? One question I get asked, and I think somebody else wrote in something like that, is, are they based on anybody I really know? And the answer is no, they aren't. Their personalities are completely made up. They may be composites of people I know or people I knew of, just from a sheer superficial standpoint. The names, though, are a lot of them are people that I knew in my parents' generation. That's a treasure trove of period names, by the way. It's like people you actually are related to or know. Okay, I have like aunts and uncles with names like Florence and Mildred. You know, nobody names their kids that anymore, right? Albert. But these names will turn up, so I do mind those from real life. The surnames, of course, are out there because those don't change very much. But there are a lot of characters too that are based on real life historic persons, and I think that James Ellroy once famously said that you can write anything about anybody as long as they are dead. And I think that's a legal truism, but here in Hawaii, I think we have to be a little more sensitive about that. We're a much smaller place, and while these people may not be living anymore, certainly their families are still around, or people who knew them are still around, and you don't want to be in a position, or I never want to be in the position where I disparage somebody in my writing or if I don't disparage them, even if I portray them in a very good light, risk getting something about them wrong, you know, because somebody will always be around that knows more about that individual than I will ever know about that individual. So what I've done, and this is the device I use, is that I base some characters on real life characters, real life people, but they exist side by side with the real life people, right? And Jason Chun and John Rosa and my friend Pat Patterson, sitting right there today, have put together this study guide for Kona Winds, where he breaks down almost in a footnote fashion, not just the terms or the events, but the people. And they have uncannily gotten right the inspiration behind a lot of those characters. There's a character who was inspired by the real life Governor John Burns back when he was an HPD detective in the 1950s. Pablo Manapit, the labor organizer, inspired a character. Koji Ariyoshi, the founder of the Honolulu Record, also inspired a character. He's mentioned in the books, but his fictitious inspiration exists side by side with the real life individual. That way I can feel free to do whatever I want with those characters, and I'm not really disparaging the real life people that they're based on because they're made up characters. But that's the device I use. And I do this, by the way, too, for institutions as well as people, right? I make up fictitious, there's a fictitious restaurant in Kona Winds, which I had made up, which was inspired by Canlis, but I couldn't put Canlis in there, one, because there's still Canlis today in Washington State, but also because it's anachronistic. It takes place in 1953, Canlis didn't open its doors till 1954, okay? But I made a fictitious restaurant based on that. But thanks, that's a great question. I don't think I've ever been asked that before.
With that, I want to thank the audience for your questions, all of which were great. It shows that we've been listening and thinking and maybe being inspired by what Scott has to say. I want to suggest, in the same way that Scott, Jason Chun threw down the gauntlet to you to write. And that perhaps people in this audience might continue to read, but maybe even stick a toe into the field of writing, maybe about your own life or maybe about your grandma's life or something. And it could be very short. It could be a paragraph, which might expand to 2 paragraphs, et cetera, but maybe in the process of writing, and I'm just going to put words in your mouth, Scott, that maybe in the process of writing, you may be able to think through some of your own histories and the histories of those around you. So with that, I want to thank JCCH for organizing this. Thanks, Scott. We will join Scott outside where there are books for sale, and Scott will conduct a book signing. So thank you very much.
Thank you.